guys, so I'm here today to do my mid-month reading wrap-up for the month of August. I have 6 books that I'm going to review for you in today's video that inspired a mixture of feelings in me, so I think that this one's going to be a bit of a roller coaster of reviews. But before I get into the books, I want to give a little shout out to today's sponsor, who is Skillshare. If you haven't seen me mention Skillshare before, they are a fantastic online learning platform. If you want to learn about something, you can learn a bit on Skillshare, and in particular I recently have been watching a lot and enjoying a lot of the classes on there surrounding Instagram. Yes, I know, how social media influencer of me, but I have been trying to experiment a little bit with my Instagram and with flat lays in particular, which is something I've always wanted to be good at because I genuinely think it's an art form, a good flat lay. I admire so many people who create amazing flat lays and I've been wanting to practice myself, so I've been watching some really fun tutorials and classes on Skillshare about how to create a sort of aesthetic feed and create fun flat lays. And also one of my favourites is a class I watched all about Instagram poetry, and I have actually shared a poem myself on Instagram recently, which I think effectively makes me an Instagram poet. Maybe you need to share more than one. But basically I've been getting a lot of fun tips and tricks from their classes on new ways to spice up my Instagram feed, and really enjoying trying that out. But you can subscribe to Skillshare for less than $10 a month if you sign up to their annual subscription. But if you want to try it out first, I have a wonderful link that Skillshare provided me down below, which will give you a 2-month free trial, so you can get a feel for all of the fun educational classes available on Skillshare that cover everything from writing to knitting and anything else you can think of in between. And now without further ado, let's get into the books. I'm going to start off with the one non-fiction book I've read so far this month, because honestly I should have reviewed this a lot longer ago than I am now. And that is The Women in the Room, Labour's Forgotten History by Nan Sloan. Now the reason I say I should have reviewed this sooner than now is because I basically finished this months ago but just never got around to reading the epilogue, and because I never finished reading the epilogue, I never marked it as read on Goodreads and I never reviewed it for you. But I finally picked it back up just to read that last little bit and officially finish that last page, and now I can let you know that I firmly enjoyed the entirety of this book. This is a non-fiction book all about the role of women in the labour movement of the late 18 and early 1900s. So that's the time period in which the actual Labour political party was being formed in the UK due to an increase in desire for political participation for those of the working classes, and more people demanding a change to the working conditions experienced by those people as well. And this, like I said, focuses on the women's role in that period. So prior to the formation of the Labour Party, during the formation of the Labour Party, and in its early years up until women gained the right to vote. And one of the things I found most interesting about this book is that I think we often think of women's political activism beginning with the suffragettes and almost exclusively as a demand for the vote, whereas women were actually involved in such a wide breadth of political activism and social activism, trying to change the lives of their peers as well as themselves, joining together as groups of women as well as uniting with men to both, fight for women's right to vote, to fight for working class men's right to vote, but also to fight for childcare, healthcare, better working conditions, minimum wage. And you get an insight into women's participation in all of those campaigns even before they had the right to vote. These women that were stepping out of the confines that society attempted to place on them, and it was so fascinating. I learned a little bit more about some women I was already aware of, like Mary MacArthur, who was heavily involved in strike action during this period. Also female authors I hadn't realised also had a political life, really, like E. Nesbit, which was really fascinating. The one thing I will say about this book though, for those of you going into reading it, and I would encourage many of you to read it whether you're British or not, whether you're a woman or not, is that this book isn't exclusively about women. Very much because this book forms itself around the labour movement of that period, you will learn a lot about men as well, because the men were the gatekeepers. The men of the upper classes were the only ones that had the right to vote or stand for parliament. They were the ones, that were able to formally found organisations that could then participate in Parliament, and for that reason it's impossible to explore women's activism in this time period and not talk about them. So you can go a few pages very much just learning about, you know, early Labour leaders that were men, but it's necessary to fully understand the backdrop of which women were working in at this time. Now, there's also a lot of acronyms in this book, which isn't a criticism, because there's just a lot of different organisations, and that was the only other thing that sometimes I got a bit confused by, because there would be multiple women's organisations, like, oh, which one was this again? But regardless, I thought this book was fantastic. I learned so much. I feel so much better informed about women's activism during this period, and I actually think I would reread parts of this book to refamiliarise myself, and it's something I've not seen a lot of books on, because like I said, most of the books I see dealing with women's political history around this period is solely focused on the suffrage movement, and often equally we don't discuss the problems of the suffrage movement in this period, and the way in which it could be actually quite a classist movement, even if it was looking for women to get the vote. So I like that this book didn't shy away from looking at the pros and cons of the actions taken during that period, and the way that these groups could be both inclusive and exclusionary. So yeah, I gained a lot from this book, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. I then read a collection of children's poetry, and that is Overheard in a Tower Block by Joseph Colo. So I'd like to preface this by saying that don't let the fact that these are children's poems stop you from reading them as an adult, because I thought this was a fantastic collection of poetry. Now, the focus is on children's experiences, a lot of which seem to be based on the author's own experiences, and the child narrator that is at the centre of a lot of these poems explores what it's like growing up in, you know, high-rise council flats in London, watching their parents go through struggles, having their father leave and not seeing their father for a long time, watching their mother become incredibly upset because of everything that's going on, but at the same time also, you know, going out, playing with their friends. You know, although being written by an adult, it really encapsulates what it is like to be a child, which is that you're not sheltered from the realities of life, and you still experience many hardships, or at least lots of children do, yet you are still able to kind of grab a hold of your imagination and are able to truly appreciate those small joys in life in a way that sometimes I think adults find a little bit more difficult. But it really gives an insight into the variety of children's lives, and there were certainly poems in this collection that I could relate to from my experiences as a child. At the same time though, I also felt like I got an insight into someone very different from me and their life, and I thought these were lovely poems. I loved poetry as a child. Like, I was always ready to consume more children's poetry as a child, and I know I would have loved this collection then, and I found it very nostalgic as an adult, but also very engaging as an adult. There was also, and this is based on a complete personal preference, little allusions to Greek myth in there, which I loved. There was poems inspired by the myth of Prometheus, which, you know, it's always an added bonus for me. And just all in all, I'm really glad I picked this collection up, because I think it reminded me how much you can gain from children's poetry even as an adult. In fact, if you're the kind of adult who doesn't read a lot of poetry but is looking to get into poetry, reading a little bit of children's poetry might be a way to go. It is the reason I read poetry, although I started as a child, but it certainly helped. Next, I want to mention Heartless by Gail Carragher, which is the fourth book in the Parasol Protectorate series. This is a fantasy of manners series set in the 1800s, following an aristocratic woman in a London very like it would have been in the 1800s, except that there are werewolves and vampires, and everyone knows there are werewolves and vampires. In fact, there's also ghosts and occasionally other supernatural creatures, but the main focus is on the werewolves and the vampires. However, our protagonist, Alexia, is a preternatural, which means that she basically cancels out the supernatural. So if she like touches a vampire or a werewolf, they stop being a vampire or a werewolf. It's one of those concepts I think you kind of just need to read to enjoy. Now, I enjoyed this book, but it's not my favourite in the series. I think I'm just finding, and this is the penultimate book in this series, although there are spin-offs, that it feels like it's done. Like, it feels like all that could happen has really happened, and I'm not really sure where the 5th book is going to go, which is the final book in the series, although I will be reading it. And I do enjoy these books, but they're kind of like palate cleansers at this point as opposed to new favourite books. They are incredibly hilarious. I love the humour in them. However, this book in particular, I found myself getting a little bit annoyed with some of the characters, and I also felt like the plot itself was just a bit pointless. Like, it just came out of nowhere, although I did really enjoy learning about some of the histories of characters in this book, like Professor Lyle. There were events in this book also very much set up for one of the spin-off series that I am really looking forward to reading. So pros and cons, it's just is what it is. Like, I would still recommend reading the first book in the series and carrying on with them, but it's not one of those series that just is 5 stars all the way through. It's just kind of like fast-paced, silly fun. I then read a novella by Tessa Dare called How to Catch a Wild Viscount. So I read this one because it was free on Kindle, and of course I'm going to take a free Tessa Dare book on Kindle any day because I have recently discovered a genuine love for this writer. But it is also a standalone, whereas all the other books I've read by Tessa Dare have been in her Spindle Cove series, and I enjoyed this. It is not the book I would suggest starting Tessa Dare with though, even though it's short and might be like a cute introduction. I don't think there's enough there to really give you a sense of her as a writer, in that it still has her characteristic wit and humour and cleverness and all of that good stuff, but it felt very rushed. And I think unlike the other 2 novellas I've read by her, which fitted the novella format perfectly, this one actually could have worked as a novel, and I think would have had more time to grow as a novel, and I would have had more time to come to care for the characters if this was a full-length novel. I still enjoyed reading it though. I read it in the space of an hour in one sitting. You know, I was still enjoying getting to read a little bit more Tessa Dare and enjoying her fun historical romances, which is what this is. I don't think I said that. Again, 1800s sort of smutty romances, that's what these books are, but always with fantastic female heroines that are incredibly feisty, and I always adore. Have not disliked a single heroine in a Tessa Dare book yet. So, you know, had all the things I like about Tessa Dare, but maybe just a little bit too condensed and a little bit too fast. It was free though, so I'm not complaining, and I still enjoyed reading it. I just don't think it's where you should start with Tessa Dare. I would start with the Spindle Cove series because that's what got me into her and I love it. I then read 2 books in a series that, oh my goodness, do I have mixed feelings about. The first one is A Lesson in Thorns by Sierra Simone. This was a gift from Chelsea and I buddy read it with Kathy, both of whom I will link down below. I really enjoyed the first book. Now, contemporary romance is not my like go-to genre. It's not something I've read a ton of or perhaps know what I like in. So I was intrigued by this but didn't have a lot to base my expectations on, if that's the correct way of saying that. But it is a dark, polyamorous romance set at this sort of old manor home in England called Thornchapel, and our protagonist Poe is a librarian who actually visited this manor house when she was a child with her parents during one summer, and she got to know all these children that she's now meeting again for the first time in years in her role as a librarian, because she's going to be the archivist at this house, which is getting a bit of a remodel. The back basically summarises our 6 main characters: the heir, the dreamer, the priest, the genius, the socialite, and the saint. So we have 6 characters. Poe is our main character, although we do occasionally hear from other characters, and the second book is from both Poe and Saint's perspective, so one of the other characters is called Saint. Let me summarise my feelings towards this one. I enjoyed this. I thought it was a good, steady build-up. Really intriguing. There is a mystery surrounding Poe's mother who went missing years ago, and she thinks she might be able to discover what happened to her by returning to Thornchapel, so there's constantly questions about that. I didn't get to know all the characters fully in this volume, so for example, one of the characters who's called Beckett, I just found a little bit pointless in this book. But however, I will say in book 2, Beckett really grew on me, and I ended up really liking him as a character as I got to know him a little bit better. I also didn't like Auden, who is one of the main love interests, and I also still don't know how I feel about him because he also grew on me in book 2, and then I changed my mind. But I did love Poe the narrator, I loved Saint, and I loved Delphine. Rebecca, again, I just felt kind of neutral on, but loved Delphine as well. There's just quite a big cast of characters here, and basically what I'm saying is that I mainly loved most of them. It just took a while for some of them to grow on me, I guess. It's hard not to talk about this book without just talking about the sequel as well. So what I will say about the sequel is that it's less of like a slow build up, because by the end of this book the romantic elements are much more central to the storyline, so you jump straight in with that in book 2. And like I said, you also get to hear Saint's perspective, and I loved learning more about Saint in book 2 and learning about him as a teenager and a relationship that he'd had with one of the other central characters, as well as the story behind some of the animosity that is very, very much made clear in this book between Saint and Auden. So I felt like I got to learn a lot and enjoy learning about these characters in book 2. However, if you've seen any reviews for book 2, you'll know that something happens at the end, okay? Like in the last 5% that is super frustrating, and it does kind of colour my whole opinion on this series so far. Now I don't want to spoil the books for you, but what I will say is that the ending to book 2 is super frustrating. I think it's going to be a red herring. I'm hoping it will be a red herring, but even if it is a red herring, because of a secret that somebody chose to keep in book 2, the consent that went on in some of the sexual acts between the characters is completely undermined. And I think that's the most difficult part about it, is the fact that it completely undermines the consent. And I don't know how the character who kept that secret can redeem themselves again. However, I will be reading book 3 because I'm still super intrigued. I'm still wrapped up in this world, but I am a roller coaster of emotions about them, and I'm not greatly pleased about where book 2 ended up going, because I was really enjoying book 2 as well. Like, book 2 was really building on book 1 in a fantastic way until that ending happened, and yeah, like, I can't imagine how it's all going to be resolved in a satisfactory way, but I'm willing to try and find out, if that makes sense. You will know if you've read these books what I mean. And I'm sorry for those of you that haven't read them for being so evasive, but I don't want to spoil the plot twists for those of you that might not want the plot twist spoiled. You can easily find the spoilers out if you want to by reading some Goodreads reviews. However, one other thing I would like to mention, because it's something that I saw in quite a lot of Goodreads reviews and I found personally a bit upsetting, is that I read quite a few reviews criticising Poe for her behaviour and reaction to grief in book 2. And as somebody who truly knows like the horror and the heartache of grieving for somebody incredibly important to you, I found that just a really unfair thing to criticise the character for, because I don't think it's our place to criticise people for the way they grieve, unless they're going out and like murdering people. If during their grief they need to look for comfort in the arms of other people, if they act a little bit selfishly, as long as they're not like harming anyone, I don't think it's our place to criticise them. And I know this is fiction, but I think when people say things like that in a review, it can be really hurtful to people reading those reviews, and it can have a wider negative impact on our attitudes towards people who are grieving. So I just wanted to mention that so that you know that I don't agree that we should criticise Poe for her behaviour, and, you know, go Poe for doing what felt right to her in that moment. But those are all of the books I have read so far in this month. I have no doubt there will be quite a few more books to review for you at the end of the month, because I am also participating in my own readathon, the Femme Fantail. I will link the announcement down below, and hope to read quite a few things. But thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I am always incredibly grateful to their support for this channel. Do check them out. I will link everything down below in the description box. And until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys.